First and foremost, I would like to inform you that as we meet here today to discuss the situation in my country, there are thousands of Syrians and honest Americans and people from other nationalities who are demonstrating on 47th Street outside this building, calling on members of this council to stop their bombing of Syria and to stop interfering in Syria and supporting terrorist groups. These demonstrations are taking place also in California and other American cities. Mr. President, this important meeting about my country, Syria, is held at a critical time as we witness serious disruptions that run contrary to last week's promising signs. This is mainly due to the fact that the United States disowned the agreement it had concluded with the Russian Federation in Geneva on the 9th of September. It is also due to the unwillingness to force the armed groups supported by the so-called international coalition to abide by the aforementioned Geneva Agreement. One must point out that the term international that is used to describe this coalition does not convey reality. That is to say, this coalition was formed outside the realm of international legitimacy, without a Security Council resolution and without coordination with the stakeholder, which is the government of the Syrian Arab Republic. It is reminiscent of other destructive coalitions that many speakers today reminded us of. These coalitions only brought disasters to countries like Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. When the American administration decided to intervene unilaterally in my country by air raids, American officials came to us and told us that Washington is committed and that the American warplanes will not target the Syrian army or vital infrastructure. It will only target ISIS. I was personally told and reassured by the permanent representative of the United States of that on behalf of her government. It was a message conveyed by her government. 2 years after the establishment of this coalition and the beginning of those raids, American officials forgot their promises and their commitments. American jets are bombing facilities for the Syrian army and vital infrastructure, and there are American soldiers on Syrian territories. This American military aggression on eastern Syria and the Turkish military aggression on northern Syria and Israeli military aggression on southern Syria means, without the shadow of a doubt, that proxy war has become a real war and a real aggression. My country welcomed the Russian-American declarations that were issued on the 9th of September, after both parties agreed to combat the terrorist organizations of ISIS and al-Nusra Front, regardless of their titles and their names. And this agreement was concluded with the knowledge and consent of the Syrian government. However, the international community, represented by this council, received a horrific shock, before which it stood helpless, unable to issue a condemnation or express outrage in the least. Or at least express preoccupation. This shock was the unjustified, brutal aggression that was launched by American, British, Australian, and Danish fighter jets on locations of the Syrian Arab army. The units of this army is combating the terrorist organization of ISIS in the mountainous area of Thorda, within the vicinity of Deir ez-Zor airport. These units had been defending tens of thousands of Syrian civilians besieged by ISIS in the city of Deir ez-Zor. This grim aggression led to numerous casualties amongst the officers and soldiers of the Syrian Arab army, 83 martyrs, and over 100 were wounded. This aggression that lasted for 50 minutes, a whole 50 minutes of air raids, that was preceded by reconnaissance flights by drones over 2 days. As I said before, 2 days before, there were reconnaissance flights by drones, and this aggression that lasted for 50 minutes paved the way for ISIS terrorists to enter this military site of the Syrian army that was targeted deliberately before the Syrian army was able to recapture it again. To add insult to injury, our soldiers and the wounded soldiers underwent another airstrike by drones while they were evacuating their positions in the mountainous area of Tharda after it was targeted. Before this deliberate and unacceptable aggression, my country had been focusing on the issue of disassociating terrorist groups, and that is in line with the Vienna II communique that was issued on the 14th of November 2015. That is to say, we wanted to determine which are terrorist groups and which aren't, and which can be considered as opposition. However, it appears that 10 months were not enough for some to solve this puzzling mystery. And it appears that some suffered from an early bout of Alzheimer while trying to solve this mystery. Along the same lines, Damascus expected Washington to fulfill its commitments in this regard by putting an end to the policies and practices of certain countries, certain well-known countries, who sponsor and support terrorism politically, logistically, financially, and ideologically through the media. And we expected an end to the influx of terrorists, weapons, and funding from countries neighboring Syria through the borders, and the use of terrorism as a tool for political blackmail. Mr. President, American reconnaissance planes, surveillance satellites, and intelligence services failed to distinguish between ISIS and those fighting ISIS. The so-called international coalition failed to do so. They are no stranger to such failure. For years, they failed to detect thousands of foreign fighters that came to Syria and Iraq from around the world, an issue that was dealt with by a speaker from this council, thankfully. And they failed to detect convoys of armed vehicles and thousands of terrorists, ISIS terrorists, during a long journey that lasted over 200 kilometers in the Syrian desert to reach the city of Palmyra, coming from Iraq. And they failed to detect thousands of lorries that steal and smuggle Syrian oil to Turkey in order to fund the attacks of ISIS. They also failed to cut off the funding of terrorist organizations, even though they know very well the origin and destination of every dollar that reaches ISIS and al-Nusra Front. The only success they were able to achieve was to fabricate false accusations, made up incidents, politicized reports, edited videos about the suffering of Syrians, to demonize the Syrian government and its allies. It is quite astonishing that the Secretary of State would use a testimony of an eyewitness, a so-called eyewitness who noticed planes over the humanitarian convoy that was attacked yesterday in northern Syria. The testimony of this eyewitness, who is a member of the so-called moderate armed opposition, Syrian opposition, this testimony was sufficient to establish that there was air bombing of this humanitarian convoy, and for Mr. Kerry to accuse both the Syrian and the Russian governments. My question is, can one individual in a crowded area that is inhabited by thousands of people, can he on his own notice airplanes, and while others, thousands who live in this area, did not see these air bombings? The issue of eyewitnesses is a laughable one, especially when we are reminded that those who accused the Syrian government of using chemical weapons relied on eyewitnesses' accounts. There was orange smoke. This is what we were told by the genetically modified Syrian opposition. No one was there. The Turkish army and the terrorists and the American army, in addition to the terrorists who stole Syrian airplanes from their parking space in airports. To refresh the memory of members of this council, I want to recall the mistakes by American officials. It appears that the American side does not learn from its mistakes. The American forces, since the establishment of the so-called international coalition, made several mistakes. It mistakenly bombed an elementary school for the visually impaired in the city of Raqqa, and it mistakenly airdropped over the city of Ain al-Arab assistance that included weapons and rockets that fell into the hands of ISIS terrorists. It mistakenly killed Syrian civilians near the city of Raqqa while claiming to target a weapons factory for ISIS. The gravest mistake was then committed by French and American forces when a joint air raid led to the death of over 200 civilians near Aleppo in the town of Manbij. Aleppo is a city that one council member was deploring and deplored the situation in Aleppo a few minutes ago. And we are reminded that 200 civilians died near this very city, Aleppo, due to a joint air raid by the international coalition. Mr. President, The latest wave of false accusations leveled at my government was the targeting of a humanitarian convoy in the countryside of Aleppo within a filthy propaganda war that is launched by well-known parties that exploit the suffering of the Syrian people for the sole purpose of cheap propaganda, political blackmail, and to uphold their agendas that have no regard to the heavy price paid by the Syrian people due to the persistence of these very same parties to deny any solution that is not in line with their agendas and to prolong the crisis. My country, Syria, has warned of the attempts of certain regional parties to torpedo the American-Russian agreement ever since it was announced and before it entered into force. I want to draw your attention to the heinous Israeli attacks on Syrian territories throughout the past weeks, which intensified once the the American-Russian agreement was announced to combat al-Nusra Front and other terrorist organizations such as al-Yarmouk, even though, and all this while the DPKO remains suspiciously silent, even though we sent many letters to this council and about the Israeli violations and the treatment of terrorists in Israeli hospitals. I wish to draw your attention also to the illegitimate Turkish military operations within the Syrian territories under the pretext of combating ISIS without prior coordination with the Syrian government and the Russian Operations Command, which is a crime of aggression according to the Charter of the United Nations and the rules of procedure of this council. It is a violation of the sovereignty of Syria and its territorial integrity. This coincides with declarations by Turkish officials that their government wants to deliver so-called humanitarian assistance to the city of Aleppo without coordination with the Syrian government and the United Nations. Mr. President, my country is ready to resume inter-Syrian dialogue with no preconditions and according to the decisions and foundations that launched this very dialogue in order to reach a political solution that is decided by the Syrians alone with no foreign intervention or interference, so that Syrians can decide their future and their options, and this can be done by Syrian leadership in a manner that would guarantee the sovereignty of Syria and its territorial integrity. Syria will not become another Libya or another Iraq. We will never allow this. In this regard, we reaffirm that the success of any political process in Syria requires engagement, cooperation, and full coordination with the Syrian government as the main partner in any related domain. No committee, meeting, or conference organized to solve this crisis can succeed while some international parties, willingly or unwillingly, seek to exclude the Syrian government, marginalize it, or doubt its cooperation with the United Nations, or undermine the success it's achieved in national reconciliation and upholding national reconciliation that is based on the voluntary disarmament of foreign fighters, the normalization of their status and issuing them with pardons and their departure to other areas. And this in turn allows for a return to normal life in the areas that they leave. And it also allows for state institutions to resume the services they provide. In conclusion, Mr. President, I have a final question. Hundreds of armed groups, tens of thousands of terrorists, can we allow them to continue their terrorism against my government, my army, and the infrastructure of Syria for over 5.5 years? Can they continue without external support? This is a legitimate question. I believe that some should acknowledge this fact. We should not be misled to believe that the situation in Syria is a civil war. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. As Secretary Kerry just quoted earlier in this session, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan had said, "My colleagues are entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts." Let's just keep in mind the facts of who is prolonging the suffering of the Syrian people. The last speaker's statement was so full of untruths that I feel no need to say anything further. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I should like to inform the Council that I have received a letter from the representative of Turkey requesting to be invited to participate in the discussion on the item in the Council's agenda. I propose, with the consent of the Council, and in accordance with the understanding reached in scheduling this meeting, to invite the representative of Turkey to participate in the discussion in accordance with the relevant provisions of the Charter and Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure. There being no objection, it is so decided. I invite the representative of Turkey to take a seat at the Council table. I give the representative of Turkey the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have asked the floor in the exercise of our right to reply. Turkish position in Syria with political, security and humanitarian aspects have been shared yesterday with the UN membership at the highest political level. I have nothing to add to that. Yet, I wish to emphasize our dismay over the certain contents of the statement delivered by the regime representative. This statement contained distorted facts, based accusations, including towards Turkey. We reject them in their entirety. Mr. President, this meeting, on the other hand, was instrumental in facilitating the exchange of views at political level with regard to the matters of mutual interest and importance on Syria. However, the utility of this meeting could have been well enhanced should the voice of the genuine representatives of the people of Syria, named the High Negotiation Council, be heard as well. We are confident that such a day will come soon. We are equally confident that eventually those responsible for the destruction of Syria and the suffering of Syrian people will be held accountable for the crimes they have committed. Until then, Turkey will stand by the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Turkey for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I wish to thank all Council members and Mr. de Mistura for their participation today. I adjourn the meeting.